Okay, in this video we're going to have a quick introduction to strings so you can quickly get started. And later in the course we have a separate section where I cover more details about strings. So in this lecture I'm going to cover what is a string, different ways to create strings in C#, and finally I'm going to talk about escape characters and verbatim strings, which are pretty handy. So a string is a sequence of characters. And as you can see in this example, in C#, we surround strings with double quote, as opposed to characters which are surrounded by single quote. There are different ways to create strings in C#. A very common way is to use a string literal. So just like declaring a variable, we start with a type, in this case string, then an identifier, and finally we assign it to a string literal. We can also concatenate strings using the plus operator. So in this example, I'm adding first name plus a string literal which represents an empty character, and finally the last name. Sometimes using string concatenation this way can create a bit of noise in your code. You might have different string variables that you're concatenating, and it's hard to visualize what the output looks like. If that's the case, you can use string format. So in C#, the string keyword maps to the string class in the .NET framework. And you learn that classes can have fields and methods. And we can declare these members as static, which means we can access them directly on the class without the need to create an object. So in the example you see here, we're calling the format method on the string class. Format is a static method, so we can directly access it using string.format. This method takes a couple of parameters. The first one is a format string, which we use to define a template for our string. Inside this template, we have placeholders. Placeholders are indicated by curly braces, and they are zero indexed. So here, placeholder 0 will be replaced by first name, and placeholder 1 will be replaced by last name. So as you see in this example, it's much easier to visualize the output as opposed to concatenating multiple strings together. Sometimes you might have an array of objects. You can create a string from combining all elements of that array using a separator. So in this example, we have an integer array with values 1, 2, 3. And in the second line, we are calling the join method of the string class, which is a static method. And we supply two arguments. The first argument, which is a string, is a separator. In this case, I would like to combine these three numbers using a comma. The second argument to this method is the array whose elements we would like to combine. Now that we have a string, we can access each of its individual characters using an index. So in this case, name of 0 represents the first character in our string. One thing you need to know about strings in C# is that strings are immutable, which means once you create them, you cannot change them. So back to our example here, we can certainly read the value of the first character in our string, but we cannot change it. So the third line here, which is indicated by red, is not going to be compiled. There are methods in the string class that allows us to manipulate strings and modify their values. But all these methods return a new string, so the original string is not changed. And that's what I mean by immutable. There are a few special characters in C# that sometimes have different meanings. For example, if you want to have a new line in your string, you need to use \n. When the compiler sees that, it automatically adds a new line. If you don't add the backslash, the compiler sees n just as the letter n. Same for tab. If you want to have a tab, you use \t. Now that brings us to an interesting situation. What if you want to use the backslash letter itself? Because when the compiler sees backslash, it thinks we are using a special character. So it's not quite sure. It might get confused. So if you want to tell the compiler that we would like to use the backslash letter, we need to represent that by double backslash. Same for single quotation mark and double quotation mark. We need to prefix them with a backslash. And that's what we call by escaping characters in C#. So these are special characters. The list of special characters, in fact, is even more than that. But personally, I have not found any of those special characters that you find in C# documentation pragmatic. Those you see in this table are the ones I have found very common. Okay, now because of these special characters, there are cases where creating a string can be a little bit messy. For example, look at this path variable here. Note all these double backslashes we have. It looks a little bit messy, doesn't it? The good thing is, in C# we have a kind of a string which we call verbatim string. And with a verbatim string, we don't have to use all these double backslashes. We can simply prefix our string with an @ sign, and as a result, we can get rid of all these double backslashes and just use a single backslash. Okay, now let's flip over to Visual Studio and do some coding.